Okay, everyone, one of our last topics is solving quadratic equations, which basically just means we're solving equations with a power of 2, like this, x squared equals some number c. The steps to solve these are just like any other equation, where you need to first isolate the variable. We're going to go through all this, but take the square root of both sides, and then you get a plus or minus answer. So these are just steps I wrote out that I'll post on the classroom. So let's look at number 1. A lot of you might already know the answer to this, but I'm going to go through all the steps. So isolate the variable. Okay, meaning there's nothing added or subtracted or multiplied or divided to your variable, and there isn't anything. So step 2, I take the square root of both sides, because when I take the square root of something squared, that cancels out that squared power. Here's an example. If you had the square root of 3 squared, right? We know 3 squared is 9. And what's the square root of 9? 3. Or back here, this is the trick. You just cross out the squared with the root and you get 3. So that's what a square root does. It cancels out the squared power. So on the left, I'm just left with m. And on the right, you have to ask yourself, okay, well, what's the square root of 1? The square root of 1 is 1. But this is where the plus or minus comes in. It's plus or minus 1 because, remember, the original equation was m squared equals 1. So I can take 1 squared, and that gives me 1. But also, quantity negative 1 squared, negative 1 times negative 1, that gives you 1. So for these types of problems, unless it's a 0, you are going to get plus or minus. You're going to get 2 answers for these, 1 and negative 1 in this case. I cannot help you right now. So for number 2, same deal. The variable is isolated. So you're going to take the square root of both sides. That cancels out. I get x equals, the square root of 0 is just 0. And like I was just saying a couple seconds ago, 0 is the only number that you won't have plus or minus attached to it because 0 doesn't have a sign. There's number 2. Number 3, variable is isolated. I go ahead and I take the square root of both sides. Squareds and the square root cancel. Now here's one similar to what we did the other day. The square root of negative 49. Can you take the square root of a negative number? Can you find a number multiplied by itself to give you negative 49? We did examples like this yesterday, I believe. And the answer is no. So in this case, we write no solution. You might be like, well, on the work before we wrote undefined. Why are you switching it now? Because we're solving an equation, and this equation has no solution. So anytime you have a negative under the square root, your answer will be no solution. Number 4, this one's a little bit different because the variable is not isolated. So first we have to subtract 8 from both sides. And I know some of you like to draw the line there. That cancels out. We get b squared equals 17 minus 8 is 9. Okay, now the variable is isolated, so I take the square root of both sides. The square and the square root cancel. The square root of 9 is 3, and I need plus or minus 3, because 3 times 3 is 9, and negative 3 times negative 3 is 9. Number 5. Again, we have to isolate the variable, so I add 1. I get n squared equals 8 plus 1 is 9. Variable is isolated, so I take the square root of both sides. The square and square root cancel out. Once again, square root of 9 is 3, and it's plus or minus because 3 times 3 is 9, and negative 3 times negative 3 is 9. Number 6, now you see something being multiplied by the variable. So to undo multiplication, we have to do division. So 128 divided by 2, again, these are not guess and check problems, you need to do the work, is 64. Again, this is not solved for x because x is still squared. So you need to take the square root of both sides. The square and the square root cancel. The square root of 64 is 8, and it's plus or minus, because 8 times 8 is 64, and negative 8 times negative 8 is 64. Number 7, another multiplication. We have to divide both sides by negative 3. to get the m by itself. So, negative 192 divided by 3, that's 64. So again, I have to get rid of the squared. I take the square root. The squared and the square root cancel. The square root of 64 is 8. I get two answers, plus or minus 8. 18, another division one. Divide both sides by 16. This one's not a nice number. So 36 divided by 16, when you put that into your calculator, you'll get 2.25. I do not recommend keeping it like that because I think that's going to confuse you. So instead, let's simplify the fraction. What goes into 36 and 16? You might say 4, maybe. So if I divide the top and bottom by 4, 36 divided by 4 is 9, 16 divided by 4 is 4, and that is 2.25. So now this goes back to the lesson the other day. I take the square root of both sides, the square and the square root cancel. I get a equals plus or minus, the square root of 9 is 3, the square root of 4 is 2, plus or minus 3/2. Number 9, now you have two moves. Again, just like solving an equation. First, you're going to subtract 1 from both sides. 37 minus 1 is 36. And then you're going to divide by 4. So this is a two-step before you get x squared by itself. 36 divided by 4 is 9. The variable is by itself. So now you take the square root. The square root of 9 is plus or minus 3, because 3 times 3 is 9, and negative 3 times negative 3 is 9. 6 more to go. I gave you a lot of examples this time. Number 10, same deal. Got to get the variable by itself. So we're going to add 1. I get 3n squared equals 27. I have to get n squared alone, so I'm going to divide by 3. I get n squared equals 9. I need to take the square root to get rid of the squared. The squared and the square root cancel. I get plus or minus 3 because the square root of 9 is 3. Number 11, I need to subtract 7. I have 3v squared, 55 minus 7, that's going to be 48. Then you're going to divide both sides by 3 to get the v squared by itself. 48 divided by 3 is 16. Now you're going to take the square root of both sides. The squared and the square root cancel. The square root of 16 is 4. You need two answers because 4 times 4 is 16 and negative 4 times negative 4 is 16. Number 12, again, two steps here. First I add 3. Negative 29 plus 3 is a negative 26. So now I have to divide both sides by 8. And I'm going to get n squared equals negative 26 divided by 8. We can simplify 26 over 8. We can divide each by 2. So that's going to be 13 over 4. And so now I go to take the square root because the n is by itself. And I get, oh, the squared and the square root cancel. But we have a problem. We have a negative under the square root. We have the square root of negative 13/4. And we talked about on the other side, can we take the square root of a negative number? The answer is no. So the answer here is no. Solution. There's no number that would make this equation work. Number 13. This one looks a little different, but you still have to get m squared by itself. So you're first going to add 4. So you get negative 2m squared equals negative 76 plus 4 is negative 72. Next, you're going to divide both sides by negative 2. And negative 72 divided by negative 2 is positive 36.